Hey guys, so we're back again, and we're going to talk a little bit about 19th century music this time. And typically, what we usually call this is the Romantic period, but there are a lot of musicologists, music historians out there that don't really like calling it the Romantic period. Some people think that it's just a continuation of the classical period, so they don't even like to call it like a separate thing anyway. So that's kind of the main reason why the chapter in the book refers to this as 19th century music instead of the Romantic period. But I'm used to calling it the Romantic period, so that's what I'll do. Um, Talk a little bit about Romanticism is like what it means and all that, especially to music. But yeah, this is the Romantic period. So I'm gonna go ahead and share screen. So this there's a lot of stuff to go over, especially in this particular chapter. So I'm gonna try to make this as quick as I can. Okay. Um, so Romantic period or 19th century music, that is time period roughly from 1820 to about 1910, give or take a couple of years here or there. Um, so these are our learning objectives. You can read those. They're also, they're the same ones that are in the textbook. And also have a list of the key individuals. We have a lot of composers to go over. There's Berlioz, Brahms, Dvorak, Smetana. Caspar David Friedrich is a painter. We've got Fanny and Felix Mendelssohn. They are brother and sister. Franz Liszt, Franz Schubert. We got Frederick Chopin. Goethe, who is a poet and kind of a philosopher, really important figure from this time period. John Philip Sousa, who was an American, the first American composer that we'll talk about. One of my least favorite, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. Mary Shelley, famous author, Frankenstein. Then we've got Tchaikovsky, Richard Wagner, not Richard Wagner, but Richard Wagner because he's German. And then Clara and Robert Schumann, who were husband and wife. So, key terms. So, art song or lead or leader, those are pretty much the same thing, but that's basically kind of the only. Well, there's also symphonic poem, tone poem. We'll talk about that too. But art song is one of the like real like new kinds of genres that is really popular during the Romantic period. It's essentially a, a short piece for voice and piano, and it can be male or female voice, so it doesn't really matter. Uh, Chromaticism, that refers to like the sound of the music, how composers are making it different from the classical period. Exoticism, we'll mention that. The idée fixe, we'll talk about that with Berlioz. Leitmotif is it's basically a melody. It's like a motive that is used throughout a piece of music to kind of connect a couple of different pieces of music. Nationalism, program music, which is the big push in the Romantic era. The Romantic era, part of Romanticism is like writing music that has like subject matter, like real subject matter. It's supposed to portray or convey a particular idea or story. That's kind of the whole big theme behind this era. Then Romanticism itself, song cycle. We won't really talk about that much. Strophic is one of those words. It means basically that. Well, it's kind of like a like pop songs. listen to songs on the radio, the verses, like the music for the verses repeat, the music for the choruses repeat, or the refrain. Um, so you use the same kind of music for, or the same music for different verses of songs. And then you jump down to this other term, through composed. That's something that's completely different, done during the Romantic era, where composers are writing new music for everything. Doesn't matter if you got a song with like 8 different verses or whatnot. They're gonna write new music for each particular verse, and it's gonna relate to uh, the song, to the text, and all that stuff. And then you've got symphonic poem, which is uh, another like kind of new type of genre. It's like a mix. It's not long enough to be a symphony. It's not multi-movement. It's usually a one movement work, and it tends to have subject matter, like a story or an idea, or um, a descriptive, like some descriptive text to go along with it, or maybe a descriptive title. So, and that's something new-ish. Like it becomes really popular during the Romantic period. Like there was a little bit of it in the classical, but it really becomes more prevalent during the Romantic period. So here are some of our important events. Starts out with the Congress of Vienna, and this is to kind of rein in what was going on in France with Napoleon and all that stuff, because the Napoleonic Wars are still happening around this time until about maybe a little bit later, about the 1820s. And you still have other revolutions that happen. I mean, you've got the American Civil War that happens during this time. You've got things going on in a lot of the Eastern European countries, especially bordering Russia, like Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic. You've got the Franco-Prussian War. You've got things going on in Poland, Russia, trying to come in and seize control of Poland. So there's still lots of stuff going on. Just no real big wars except for our Civil War, which we won't really talk about because that's U.S. history. It doesn't really have much impact on anything that really happens in Europe. We've got a list of like some of the pieces we'll talk about when they are composed. Things like Beethoven's Death. You've got Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818. And then over here to the side, this is the painting. It's from the textbook, but it's also one of my favorite paintings. The Wanderer, or The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. And this painting just kind of embodies the whole feeling of 19th century music, like romanticism in general. You've got a sense of adventure, a sense of mystique, because you've got this person, like he's obviously climbed to the top of a precipice. He's looking out over the land, but you don't see his face. You also can't see a lot of the land because it's covered in fog. So there is this mystery there. So sense of adventure, the sense of mystery. You got the nature aspect because he is out in nature. There's nothing industrial, technological, like nothing about that in this painting. And those are all things that that are that are romantic kind of ideals that a lot of composers try to convey in their music, and artists and writers try to do that in their works as well. Um, in art, the visual art, we'll talk about this a little bit, but um, visual art and literature, they kind of move at a faster pace sometimes, and halfway through the 19th century, they actually shifted focus. They went from romanticism to more of a focus on realism. And realism is like it, it's like depicting everyday life. You know, like painters would paint a scene from everyday life, like a kitchen table or just people doing normal people things, that sort of stuff. So very different from music because music stayed focused on romanticism and especially nature and dealing with the supernatural and like these things that are just kind of exotic. Um, and then they also like music kind of went towards nationalism as well, using like folk tunes and folk songs and writing pieces of music that about certain places where they're from or writing music for their country, really, composers taking pride in their heritage and where they're from. So that also becomes pretty important and very prevalent towards the end of the Romantic period, the 19th century. So we'll talk about that a little bit too. All right. So quickly, so here's a little bit about Romanticism, like what it is, what it kind of means. So cultural movement, stressing emotion, imagination, and individuality. So I've already kind of mentioned the imagination part with the supernatural and all that. Emotion. So composers are and artists and writers like they're really stretching like musicians, they're stretching what they can do with an orchestra, like how soft, how loud, they're adding musicians to the orchestra, making it bigger so they can make louder louds and then softer softs, more contrast, I guess you could say. Um, and they're trying to figure out ways to express like different kinds of emotion, like figuring out different ways to write music to make it sound spooky or supernatural or horrific, creating tension and all that kind of stuff. So they are there is a lot of innovation going on in that regard. And then you've got this thing, individuality. So if you go back, classical period, Baroque, and further on, like it, I mean, you can kind of tell if it's Beethoven. 'Cause Beethoven kind of starts this like creating an individual sound in his works. But you listen to Mozart, Haydn, a lot of other classical composers, or even compare some Baroque composers. They all kind of they can sound the same, and they all kind of write in a similar fashion. Especially in the classical period, they're using the same kind of structure, the same kind of form, um, writing their music the same way, really. And the Romantic era is everyone kind of diverging, like taking their own paths and exploring their own kind of individual tastes, their own individual voices and what they like. And this is an era where they don't have like a patronage system. They're not employed by the church. They're not employed by these rich, wealthy families anymore. You have solo artists, musicians, and composers, so they are able to kind of explore their own individual music making ways, I guess you could say. So this really becomes fostered during the 19th century and Romanticism, and it just continues because when we get to the modern era, there are lots of just different schools of thought, different ways of doing things, different experimentations that go on that just continue to kind of take things to extremes. Mention nationalism, so pride in one's culture or nations expressed through the arts. Exoticism. So, people have always kind of uh, experimented with exoticism and trying to put that into art and music. Mozart wrote the Abduction from the Seraglio and incorporated Turkish, what he thought was like, okay, so European versions of Turkish music. So it's not real in a sense. It's still kind of stereotyped, kind of borderline racist because you're taking some concepts from a different culture and you're making it European, making it fit into your uh, confines, like what as music. So um, people are still doing that in the Romantic era. Realism, talked about that. Mentioned the Napoleonic Wars. Transcendentalism is kind of the main like philosophical thing going on during the 19th century, and it's really just more of a connection with nature. Um, that the divine is in everything, us, everything in nature. Um, so that just kind of plays into the whole uh, mystique of nature and draws a lot of composers and artists to focus a lot of their works on things in nature, especially when you have nature and the supernatural. Like that's a really big draw to a lot of composers and concert goers because this is what people wanted to listen to back then. They wanted something with a cool, unique, interesting story that kind of draws them in. Inventions. So big thing, you got trains and railway systems. So now you could get from, say, Vienna to Paris in a couple of hours, Vienna to Russia in like a few hours. Like this opens up a whole new thing. So all of these composers we talk about, like they know each other. Um, they all know each other. They all know each other's music, and this is very different from before. Yeah, the big composers they would know each other, especially if they were in the same city. But now it's like everyone's traveling. Everyone can get to somewhere else. And you can experience all these different things. You've got people coming from Europe over to America and vice versa. So that is going to change everything. The way that things work, it's going to change what happens in the arts because they're going to have so many different influences, not just influences in one country, but from all throughout the world, really. Um, Other things like steam powered ships, you got the telegraph, so people can communicate faster. Photography, like one of the photographs here, like up at the top, that's Charles Darwin, and that's a real photograph of him. A lot of the pictures in these slides, I've tried to find like actual photographs of the composers so you can really know what they looked like instead of just an artist rendering, which is really cool. You've got sound recording that's going on. So one of the composers, Franz Liszt, like if you search him on YouTube, you can probably find this. And recently there had surfaced a video of a masterclass that Franz Liszt did towards the end of his life. Sadly, there's no sound because it'd be really cool to hear his voice, and he also plays piano during this. It would have been really awesome to be able to see and hear him playing, but you can't. It's still cool though that you can see him and see how he interacts with everyone. The timing of it, like it's the older recording things, like the timing is off, so I think it's sped up a little bit more than it would. So that's weird, but it's still a cool thing. And with all of this stuff going on, you've got electricity. Like people are experimenting with electricity because you get light bulbs and things like that. Electricity is still more for like the higher class. You have to have money because it costs a lot to have a whole mansion or house or whatever wired for electricity. But it's still crazy to think that you have electricity beginning when you're just now getting like trains and all these railway systems and stuff. So it's pretty cool. There's a lot of stuff going on. And not to forget that the the industrial revolution is pretty much in full force during this time too. So the middle class is continuing to grow and to gain strength, and that has a lot that has a huge impact on music and art because of who is actually consuming both of those things. So with art, visual art, a lot of the works from this period are very imaginative. Um, like I mentioned, there's some exoticism going on. You have a resurgence of Gothic style, which kind of makes sense because, I think Gothic style, first thing that comes to mind are gargoyles, and that's supernatural. So it, makes total sense that the Gothic style comes back during this period, especially in architecture and all that. But yeah, a big focus on individual style, nature, supernatural, um, and then like I said, you have the shift to realism. Um, and then you also have people that are trying to take everything to the extreme. So that's one of the examples here. The one on the left, if you're looking at it, um, is the Raft of the Medusa, by a French painter. I think his name is Jericho. And so the story there is, the Medusa was this French ship, and it sunk. And while it was sinking, I think it was like 115, 120 people, survivors, were able to have this makeshift raft. And to have that many people, it was a huge raft, part of the ship. Um, but out of those hundreds of people, about only 15 survived. So, and it took like a couple of weeks for them to be rescued. So you have lots of people just dying from probably injuries, starvation, dehydration, all that stuff. And unfortunately, if you're stuck out at sea that long, there's cannibalism that's going to happen so that people survive. Um, and all of this stuff is depicted in this picture. So Jericho, like his whole thing behind this was to show that the French government failed on in one regard, and then also to just show the grotesque, realistic nature of this historical event that occurred. And this had a very this painting had a very polarizing premiere. It ruffled a lot of feathers, so to speak. So it's just an very interesting example of one extreme, and then to the right you have something completely different. This is J.W. Turner. He's one of my favorite painters. His style is it's pre-impressionistic. um, so he's using a lot of colors, a lot of color palettes. You have nature, because so this is the title is Temare, I think. It's the name of the last great like British warship, the sail warship, that was still out at sea until sometime halfway, through the 19th century. And this ship is being brought into dock by a tugboat. You can kind of see it. It's the little brownish black shape, and it has like a smokestack going up, and you can see kind of the smoke coming out. So this tugboat is pulling this warship into dock, and they're going to tear it apart and just use it for scraps, use it for whatever. It's just going to be trash. So on the one hand, you have this, it's kind of like a this last goodbye, like signaling the end of an era. the end of the great British Navy, because they were revered as having one of the greatest navies of all time. But then you also have this just kind of this realistic sadness. I mean, because this boat is, this is the last time it's going to be on water. It's about to be destroyed, and there's going to be nothing left of it ever. Um, and then also, on top of that, you just have a lot of like this painting. It just kind of leaves everything up to you. It leaves everything up to your imagination. Because looking at it, you get to decide really what time of day this is. I mean, to me, it kind of looks like it could be sunset, it could be sunrise. I think it's probably sunset. The way that it looks like the light is playing on the water. Um, but then again, who knows? And then you also just have like vague impressionistic of what's out there, kind of like with the wanderer, everything's covered by the fog, leaves mysterious quality to it. So here again, it has that mystique, that imaginative quality. And again, nature. I mean, you're out at sea. It's really like nature, nature and in the industrial revolution, the fact that things are changing. So there's a lot going on within this piece, which, looks really simple. But anyway, I'll stop rambling. That's visual art in a nutshell, basically. So back to the music part. So I mentioned the middle class, the rise of the middle class, the continuing rise of the middle class has a huge effect on music education, especially in terms of like who's being educated. I mean, pretty much every home has a piano. Lots of people are learning how to play instruments, either for a profession or just for enjoyment. I mean, people are entertained, have salon concerts, soirees, all the time at their homes. So that changes things. You have these great European conservatories, which are changing the landscape of music and producing a lot of great composers and great musicians. You've got more public concerts, the big lavish concerts, and also, like I mentioned, these intimate recitals. So there's a lot of different kind of music being composed for those. And then you also get this like musician stereotype, and this can be for composer or the musician in general, but just that a person that is a musician during this time is seen as being like very individualistic and very eccentric, which kind of makes sense because if you go into the arts, I mean, and you study it for a long time, like your mind, your brain does start to work a little differently. Studies show that. So I mean, yeah, it makes sense. We're a little weird, but that but now you're starting to have these stereotypes and things like that surface, which kind of foreshadows a lot of the psychological stuff that happens towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. The study of psychology and personalities and all that stuff. You've got a whole lot more virtuoso performers. Most of the people that we talk about will be virtuosic performers on their instrument, typically piano. We don't really get to talk about Paganini, but Paganini was like one of the greatest violin players of all time. He was alive during this era. Um, and aside from that, like I mentioned before, you've got no more patrons. So everybody's kind of on their own. Now, are they still supported by rich people? Yeah. I mean, they're paid money, sometimes given an allowance to do things and all that stuff, but they're not like indentured servants, like Haydn was a servant to the Esterhazy family. Bach worked for the church for several different churches, but no more of that. Like everybody's kind of on their own, which leads to the individualism. So, and then we have like just some general characteristics of the music itself. So, you still have these great melodies, but they're not like as nice and neat and memorable as in the classical period. They're a little more disjunct, meaning there are lots of different leaps. Like the notes aren't close together, they can be further apart. I mentioned larger performing forces. So you've got orchestras jumping from 60 musicians to over 100. So lots of people playing. So it creates more contrast. Um, Rubato is kind of a tempo fluctuation. So rubato, like you could slow down a part, speed it up, slow it back down, go back to the regular tempo. So just lots of changes in tempo, changes in how the music flows. More use of chromatic and dissonant sounds. So this is a way for composers to experiment more with their with their sounds and just creating different palettes, different colors of sound. Art song and lead, and then the program music. So that's really about doing having more subject matter, like having a story that is unfolded as the music goes on, or like there's a work called Pictures at an Exhibition, written by Modest Mussorgsky, a Russian composer. We don't get to talk about him, not enough time, but he wrote each movement of this based on a painting. And then in between each painting, there's a promenade, which is, it basically signifies like, all right, the person's walking from painting to painting, which is really cool. Like it tells this whole unique story. Like as the listener, you are the person in at this art gallery, and it's taking you on a journey. Like it's, the music is walking you through uh, the museum to each painting. It's really cool. So we'll talk a lot about program music. So on to Franz Schubert, our first composer we'll talk about. You're going to notice that a lot of the composers from this era died very young. Franz Schubert, he was an Austrian composer, lived from 1797 to 1828. So he was only 31 years old when he passed. Now, the thing with Schubert, there are two possibilities. He either died of typhoid fever, or as some people believe, he died from syphilis, which would have been an agonizing death because you pretty much kind of go crazy and your body kind of rots from that. So yeah, either way, pretty awful way to go, especially at age 31. But he played violin, piano, organ, and voice, and he was a singer. He wrote 9 symphonies. So again, there's this curse of the Ninth Symphony. But even though he only lived 31 years, he wrote over 600 art songs. So remember, art songs, that's for voice and piano. And Schubert was kind of, if Haydn was the father of the symphony, the father of the string quartet, Schubert was definitely the father of the art song. So he was very well known for that. Schubert was alive kind of at the same time as Beethoven. Beethoven died in 1827. They almost died in the same year. But Schubert didn't really, he was kind of a reserved person, kind of shy. So he definitely did not um, uh, He was not in the same circles as Beethoven, was not as famous as Beethoven during his life. He was kind of in Beethoven's shadow a little bit, but he did have a lot of his works performed in the very small, like salon recitals and in those intimate settings. And for art songs, that's great. That was the perfect setting. So that's why he wrote a lot of those. Um, One of his most famous art songs is Der Erlkönig, or the Earl King or the Elf King. So the Erlkönig, it's written for voice and piano, a male voice, the tenor voice. What's so interesting about this particular art song and a lot of Schubert's songs is that there's a lot of emotion, a lot of different things portrayed. The piano takes on kind of a character of its own. That happens a lot in Schubert's music. But for this one, the Erlkönig, there are four characters featured in the text, and the singer portrays all four of these characters: the narrator, the father, the son, and also the Elf King. And each time he switches character, like his voice changes. So, like for the father, it's a lower voice. The Elf King, like you can see the face change, and he's like trying to entice the son to come with him because he's trying to basically steal the son's soul. And then the boy, the son, higher voice range, louder because he's like yelling "help me" and all that stuff to his father. So there are a lot of things going on here. You've got a lot of emotion. You've got the supernatural with the Elf King, um, and it's really cool. So the story. So there's an anxious boy. He's being carried home at night by his father, riding on horseback. The boy is sick, so the boy begins to hallucinate, and the father's trying to comfort him. The boy is seeing the Elf King. He's hallucinating the Elf King, thinks he's being attacked. The father races faster towards home, but unfortunately, once they reach home, the narrator tells you that the son is dead. Um, Now, the legend, so this is kind of a Scandinavian tale. The original Scandinavian text suggests that it's not the Elf King or the Erlkönig, but actually the daughter. Um, so in Scandinavia, evidently the Elf King's daughter kind of had a track record of stealing children. Like, that's kind of weird, but hmm. um, but anyway, so it could have been the Elf King's daughter instead of the Elf King himself in the legend. But it's a really cool song, just a perfect example of romantic era writing, especially with the piano part, because with the piano, it's like a very fast. It goes and it's meant to kind of portray the horse galloping. So it's going really fast, and towards the end, it slows down just as the horse is slowing down its gallop to a stop. So it's really really cool. One of my favorites. So you guys will get to listen to that. Um, Also next, so we've got the Mendelssohns, Felix and Fanny. Yes, I know Fanny, awful name, but yeah. um, so they were brother and sister, and you'll notice that they both died pretty young. Felix 38, Fanny at 41. They died in the same year, both from a stroke. Now, if that isn't some kind of family thing going on there, yeah, there's something wrong. Like those people probably needed to get checked out if you got two kids that died of a stroke in the same year. So obviously you can tell Fanny, she's the older sister. Felix is the younger brother. They're both German. They lived mid 1800s to 1847. Um, So Felix is the more famous one because he was the man. Um, and even though he only lived 38 years, just like with Mozart and with Schubert, he wrote 750 works. So he was very prolific. He was very, uh, say, uneven temperament. Basically, he had temper issues, anger problems. Some probably anxiety, depression, some mental instability going on there too. Um, but he was a very good composer, well respected. He was known as the Mozart of the 19th century. Robert Schumann, another composer we'll talk about, actually coined that phrase and called Mendelssohn that. And it's a it's an apt nickname because Mendelssohn's music is very much like classical in style. He does have some romantic tendencies. You know, he wrote a piece of music kind of based on A Midsummer Night's Dream, the play. So that's pretty cool. But the form, the structure, kind of even the way that he wrote, the way that his pieces sound are very classical. Um, and he wrote a lot of different things. He did five symphonies. He wrote art songs. He wrote just orchestral pieces, chamber music. Wrote some operas. He wrote a very good oratorio, Elijah. So he wrote a lot of different things too. And if you guys are familiar with The Greatest Showman and that movie that came out, you probably recognize the name Jenny Lind. So Jenny Lind was the famous Swedish singer. She evidently was very, I don't know if they had an intimate relationship, but Felix was very taken with Jenny Lind and wrote a lot of very passionate letters to her. Don't know if there was ever really anything involved between them, but you know, a relationship, but they worked together several times. Felix wrote a bunch of music for her. So there's that connection for you guys. Like I mentioned, died of a stroke. So now Fanny, she was a virtuoso pianist, piano player, but didn't really get to perform, didn't really get to compose a lot because she was a woman and because her father and her husband that she married, they both didn't want her to be a music to be a working musician. They wanted her to take her rightful place in society as a woman, because their family was a member of high society and there were certain expectations on you. So she wrote about 500 compositions. Some of those were published under Felix's name because she wasn't allowed to publish them, but most of them went unpublished just because of her situation. She wasn't allowed to publish them, which is really sad because her works are really good, just as good as Felix's works. Thankfully, we know a lot about Fanny because she had a very famous, well respected composer as a brother. Um, for other female composers, they, some of them didn't have that same situation. So, um, for the Mendelssohns, so you guys will listen to The Wedding March by Felix Mendelssohn from A Midsummer Night's Dream, one of the famous wedding marches that's always used at weddings. The other one is by Richard Wagner from his opera Lohengrin. We won't listen to that one, but at least you get to listen to this one, so it should be familiar. And then you're going to listen to a nocturno by Fanny Mendelssohn. So she was, a great piano player. So that means she wrote a lot of really good piano pieces. A nocturno is kind of like a short character piece that would have been written for piano. Chopin wrote a lot of nocturnes, so you'll actually get to listen to a Chopin nocturne later on. But anyway, both of those are really great. Now on to the other pair, the other duo. So the Schumanns were husband and wife. So Mendelssohn's brother and sister, Schumann's husband and wife. That's important. um, so Robert Schumann, 1810 to 1856, was 46 years old. So again, kind of a short life. He had mental issues, like severe mental issues. He actually tried to commit suicide 2 years before he died. And then after that, he was admitted into a mental asylum, never recovered from that, and died 2 years later of pneumonia. So he basically died there. Really, really sad. But it's kind of, I don't know if it was ever he was diagnosed with a lot of different things, but it's clear that he had a very severe mental disorder. Some people think he probably had like some kind of personality disorder. Definitely something like bipolar, because he suffered from depression and all that. But very, very sad, but kind of common in people that are um, artistically eccentric. It's kind of common throughout history for that to happen. But so he was a composer, a pianist, and an influential music critic. He was a great piano player until he actually injured his hand and couldn't play anymore. Story goes that he created this device to like stretch out his hands, to help him to play better, and that device actually like permanently injured the ligaments in his hand, so he couldn't play anymore, which is really sad. But he wrote a lot of things, wrote symphonies and such. But he's very well known for his character pieces for piano. And for Schumann, he wrote a lot of program music. Um, and there's a specific set of piano pieces called Carnival. And these are 21 short pieces for piano that depict different scenes from Carnival, the festival before Lent, and different people attending Carnival. And some of these are his friends and composers, like the one that you'll listen to on this slide. So this is Schumann's like musical representation of Chopin um, in Carnival, which is really really cool. Um, Now Schumann, like I mentioned, he was a music critic, so he was kind of one of the first like big name music critics, and kind of, I guess you could say, helped to turn that into a profession, like being a musical critic. So that's kind of important too. Now Clara, um, his wife, she outlived him by a while. She lived to be 76. She was also German. Now, she was one of the greatest pianists of the era, virtuoso, only rivaled probably by Franz Liszt. And she actually had a 61-year concert career, and performed very, almost up to her death. Her and Robert, they had 8 children. Now, Clara, she only composed 66 pieces of music, but they are amazing. You'll listen to part of her piano concerto. I've gotten to play in the orchestra for this concerto a couple of times, and her writing is amazing. I actually prefer her writing to Schumann's. It's very beautiful. It's very passionate and expressive. It's really really great. Um, so you'll get to listen to that in the slide on this one, and it's just a snippet. It's just like 3 or 4 minutes of it, so you won't get to hear all of it. But um, interesting thing about Clara is that she and Robert, they were both friends with lots of composers. Johannes Brahms, who we'll talk about later, was a friend of the family, And Clara stayed very close friends with Brahms for the rest of her life. And it's not, um, we don't know for sure, but it's thought that they may have been romantically involved at some point, or there may have been some romantic tension, but maybe out of respect for the family, Brahms didn't do anything. Don't really know, but we do know that they were very close, that there could have been something more. So, um, on to yet another piano player. This is kind of a trend. We have Frederick Chopin. So, Chopin, another one who died young. He had like really bad health problems. He was a very frail individual, would constantly be sick, constantly suffered from health issues. So, his early death, it wasn't, I mean, could it have been prevented? Probably, but it wasn't like, wasn't a shock like some others. It's not like he, tried to commit suicide or anything like that, or suddenly died. He think he died of tuberculosis, or some people think he might have died because he got sick so much and his heart just kind of gave out. Very weird, very strange, but he was just a very frail individual. Anyway, but so virtuosic pianist. So I mentioned Poland, a lot of political tensions in Poland, Russia trying to come in and take over. Um, Chopin was always was very um, unhappy with the government there a lot of the time that he spent in Poland. And so he actually moved to Paris and pretty much spent the rest of his life in Paris, became his second home. Chopin, since he was kind of a frail individual, didn't really like big concerts, so he preferred intimate settings, the salon performances, the recitals, and he also taught privately. And he charged a a huge fee to teach people. So he made a pretty good living doing that. He wrote over 230 works, and most of them are for piano because that was his primary medium. He was friends with Franz Liszt, really good friends. If you watch the movie Impromptu, I think it's Hugh Grant that plays Chopin in the movie, but it depicts kind of a fictional vacation that Chopin, Liszt, George Sand had. Kind of depicts Chopin and George Sand having this relationship. I think they were married or maybe secretly married, but George Sand was a famous author, French author. I can't remember her real name, but George Sand was her pen name. So, yeah, lots of interesting things going on with many of the composers from this era. And plus, we know more about them too. So anyway, Chopin's music is very improvisational in style, generally speaking. Sometimes when he was performing, he would forget what he wrote and just kind of improvise. Um, that's kind of cool, especially him being able to do that. Um, However, the nocturnes are definitely more structured out of all of his pieces. They do have dramatic character, so there's a lot of expression in that, and they are very difficult. They're very demanding on the performer too. So they're not easy to play. And you guys will get to listen to. I didn't put the title up there. I think it's the Nocturne in E flat. So it's his most famous nocturne. You guys will recognize it. because it's used in a lot of movies and a lot of commercials and things. If I think about it, I'll try to remember to put the title up there. All right. So Franz Liszt. I know I'm going through this fast, but got a lot to go through. Liszt was Hungarian, lived a pretty good life, 74 years old. Liszt's father, it's really difficult to say, was in the service of the Esterhazy family. So his father knew Haydn, knew Beethoven personally. So that's kind of cool. Liszt was probably the greatest piano player of the time, and definitely wrote some of the most difficult piano music. A lot of this era was just pushing instruments, pushing performers to the extreme, and Liszt, as well as Chopin, but more so Liszt, like really did that in his piano writing and his writing for orchestra and such. Um, and kind of shows in this development. So Liszt is kind of one of the people that developed this new German school of composition, of writing music. So you have this program music. Okay. He's helping to further this along because Liszt creates this new genre of the symphonic poem or the tone poem. So this is a piece of orchestral music, one movement in which some kind of extra musical program that provides either a narrative or illustration. So story, descriptive title, idea, imagery, painting, that sort of thing. And he wrote several tone poems. Also, experimentations with musical forms. So this brings back in the through composed, composing these big, long, one movement orchestral works. Like that's something brand new as well. And then the innovations in harmony. So they are using chromaticism, notes that are closer together, these harsh sounding tones, creating new kinds of scales, new kinds of chords in order to write new sounds, new kinds of music. Again, they're just trying to take what the classical period did and make it new, make it more interesting, making it more, which is, kind of the thing with romanticism. So you guys will get to listen to Les Préludes. Took him almost 10 years to write this one. It started out as something completely different and then ended up being that piece. It was supposed to be named something else. Les Prelude, like this piece, was supposed to be part of like a bigger collection of works for orchestra. Um, but in the end, he settled on naming it after an ode, a poem written by Alphonse de Lamartine, something. I can't speak French, but anyway, uh, he wrote this before he wrote the music before deciding on the name. So even though the ode is connected to the piece, is inspired by other things. But this is the third of Liszt's 13 symphonic poems. So, like I told you, he wrote a lot of these. Um, and cyclical form. So, this brings back the idea of the leitmotif or the motive. So, you've got this theme that inspires all of the thematic material throughout the piece. And this theme will recur, cyclically, periodically throughout the piece. So that's what it means. That this theme keeps coming back. It's just a theme that connects everything together. You guys will only listen to a little bit of this one. It's about 15 minutes long, but I think there's only like a 3 or 4 minute clip here for you guys to watch. Now, on to one of my favorites, Hector Berlioz. So, Berlioz has a very interesting story. Um, he was a composer, conductor. His family didn't really want him to become a composer. They wanted him to be a medical physician, a doctor, and he actually went to med school. But the story kind of goes that whenever they began to like cut open cadavers, cut open bodies, and study anatomy, that Berlioz didn't really like that. So he evidently like jumped out the window and ran off and never went back. But he ended up being a composer and didn't write a lot of works, only about 50. He had periods where he didn't do a lot. He was, I guess, maybe lazy, unmotivated. And then he had periods of time where he, would write several large pieces of music. But he did win a very prestigious prize, the Prix de Rome, which is pretty much the biggest prize that you can win for composition in Europe. He won that in 1830. And basically, this pretty much paid for him to live in Rome for a couple of years and do nothing but compose music, which is cool. But he kind of went through one of his, I guess, lazy phases during that time and didn't really accomplish as much as people would have liked for him to accomplish. Um, he he's really famous for his piece of music, the Symphony Fantastique, which is a program symphony. It's program music, so each movement is accompanied by a description, kind of a story, telling what's happening. And the whole symphony is about this artist who has a very vivid imagination, and he's pretty much poisoned himself with opium in the depths of despair because his beloved has not, does not notice him. um, he's hopelessly in love with this person, and she doesn't even know who he is, doesn't even recognize him. So and this is kind of mirroring real life, because Berlioz fell in love with this lady, Harriet Smithson, who was a Shakespearean actress, and they had never met. He actually just saw her one time in Paris performing a Shakespeare play and just fell head over heels madly in love with her, and never met before. He was just in love, and he wrote this symphony for her. Kind of crazy, but yeah. So Harriet Smithson is pretty much the beloved um, in the story, and Berlioz is pretty much the artist of this story. Now, what makes this piece of music even more interesting, especially from a musical standpoint, is the use of the idée fixe, which is basically a motive. It's just a musical theme that reoccurs throughout the whole piece of music, and it represents the beloved. So, anytime in the story that something reminds the artist of his beloved, or he thinks he sees his beloved, you hear the idée fixe, and it's usually played by the clarinet. Um, so you guys will listen to March to the Scaffold in here, and then also for the listening assignment, the Witch's Sabbath, which is the final movement. So March to the Scaffold, basically kind of in the story, and again, this is like opium dreams here. He has like people like they think that the artist has killed his beloved, so the artist is being executed. So he's being marched to the scaffold, to the guillotine, because this is France. They're known for their guillotines. The cool thing about this is that at the end, right before he's about to be beheaded, he thinks he sees his beloved in the crowd. So everything is quiet. You hear the beloved theme played by the clarinet, and then shoom, the guillotine comes down. Then you hear the boom, boom, boom. That's his head rolling on the floor. And then the dramatic conclusion. So it's a really cool piece of music. It's one of my favorites. So I hope you guys enjoy that, and the Witch's Sabbath. And just for the listening assignment, see if you guys think it relates to the story. Like, do you hear the story being conveyed through the music? That's kind of the main thing here. All right, so on to Brahms. So German composer. He thought of himself as the heir apparent to Beethoven, and other people thought of him as Beethoven's successor. So there was a lot of that going on, just a lot of anxiety to go with that. Brahms had a lot of pressure on his shoulders. Um, it took him 21 years to write his first symphony because people were like, "Ah, oh, Brahms, he's going to carry on the symphonic tradition of Beethoven and write great symphonies." Well, because of all that pressure, it took him forever to actually finish that first symphony, and he only wrote four during his lifetime, just because he was like painstakingly working on these to make them perfect. So Brahms, he was kind of a traditionalist, also an innovator. His music is very kind of classical in form, kind of in structure. He uses sonata form in order to compose, but he also explores different harmonies, different keys, and all that stuff. His lyricism, his melodies are amazing, very different from classical melodies. They are more romantic style melodies. His music is very expressive, uses folk tunes and things like that from his native Germany. So he does embody a lot of romantic ideals, but is kind of a traditionalist at heart. Um, like I mentioned, always kind of in Beethoven's shadow. He at least felt like he was in Beethoven's shadow. If not for that, he probably would have composed a lot more, especially more symphonies, because he was really known for his orchestral work. Um, Death, he either died from jaundice or cancer of the liver. So basically, he drank too much, which, you got to think about this. Back then, the water probably wasn't the best thing to drink. So, what else do you have? Coffee, wine. I mean, that's about it. Some kind of alcoholic drink. So, think about Game of Thrones, or any other kind of period show that you've watched. It's either coffee, tea, some kind of hot drink, or wine, beer, mead, something like that. Something where the water is like processed and boiled, and you get all the bad stuff out of there. So anyway, you guys will listen to a movement from Brahms's Symphony Number One. Like I said, it took him 21 years to write it. Classical form with romantic harmonies and melodies. So the movement three is basically a minuet and trio, which is a classical form. And there is, sorry, there is several shouts to Brahms, like an homage to Beethoven. He includes some rhythms and different melodies that Beethoven used, incorporates them into his symphony, and that is, meant kind of as a shout out and homage to a fellow composer or an earlier composer. So enjoy listening to that. It's just kind of a little snippet from the third movement. All right, so on to nationalism. So you've got two examples. They're both from the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia. Smetana and Dvorak. So Smetana is kind of considered the father of Czech music. Came before Dvorak, really established, like I guess you could say, like a Czech sound in music. I don't know. But he's well known for using folk tunes and things like that from the Czech Republic. He wrote lots of music based on places and themes from Czechoslovakia. The one that you guys will listen to, the piece, is called The Moldau, which is from a larger work called My Homeland. And the Moldau is basically a river, one of the great rivers that runs through Bohemia, part of Czechoslovakia at the time. And the Moldau uses tone painting, kind of like word painting in the Renaissance. Tone painting is just using the instruments to convey what's happening in the story. So there are so at the beginning, it's a river. It's the beginning is depicting like the beginning of the river, and even as instruments are added in, it's just a very flowing kind of melody, and it's meant to imitate the flow of the river. There's a part that imitates the rapids where the brass come in and it gets louder and crash cymbals and all that stuff. There's a scene like a wedding scene, so that's where like one of the folk tunes is brought in and you hear like wedding music as you're passing by floating down the river. So it's really really cool. It's one of my favorite pieces of music. It's amazing. I hope you enjoy it as you listen to it and hear the tone painting aspect of it. Dvorak, also Czech, he did use folk tunes and rhythms from his homelands of Moravia and his native Bohemia, but he's kind of famous for something else. So he moved to America for a few years, 1892 to 1895. Lived in New York, but also in Iowa, in Centerville, Iowa. Don't know why, but Iowa. Um, and while he was there, he wrote his Symphony Number 9 called From the New World or the New World Symphony. And he incorporated a lot of American sounds, things to depict like the American prairies, using African American spirituals like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." There's a tune in there that sounds very reminiscent of that. Um, so you get to listen to part of Movement 2 from the New World Symphony. You should, I think this is the one that has like a version of "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." It'll sound kind of like a spiritual in there. And so with Smetana, you get to hear the Czech side. And then with Dvorak, you get kind of a fusion of the European with the American. So that's kind of cool. So hopefully you guys will recognize or at least hear kind of the American, the folk, spiritual American influence in that. All right, so the Moldau and Symphony Number 9, the New World Symphony. Now, along those same lines, we have Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. So Tchaikovsky was Russian. There are some other Russian composers we could talk about, but we don't really have time. Tchaikovsky was the most important and the most famous of those. He's the first internationally famous Russian composer. He was kind of controversial because he, he composed Russian music, like he does use, folk tunes and things like that, but he was also very European in the way that he wrote. He advocated for using European styles and traditions. Um, so he wasn't like a full blown Russian nationalist, and he was kind of called out at times for that, especially by his fellow composers and, of course, the hierarchy, the Russian hierarchy, because they're kind of crazy. But anyway, Tchaikovsky was still famous. He composed about 169 works. He's famous for his symphonies, his orchestral works, and his ballet. So he wrote music for several ballets: Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, The Nutcracker, Petrushka, and others. So you guys will listen to the finale and watch the finale of Swan Lake, which is it's a really cool ballet and really good music. Um, all of his music is great. His symphonies are definitely worth listening to. Amazing symphonies. So Tchaikovsky is also controversial because he was gay. And of course, being in Russia or being gay at all during this time, you have to hide the fact that you were gay. Because especially in Russia, he would have been executed. Like even in Britain and England, he would have been thrown in jail and probably executed at some point. Um, so that was a big thing. He had kind of a fake marriage to hide behind. And he suffered a lot from depression, probably because he had to hide his lifestyle and his true personality. And they say officially he died of cholera, which is drinking, really bad infected water. But some people think he committed suicide, um, probably related to depression and all this other stuff. So really sad ending. He only composed six symphonies, and he died right after finishing his sixth symphony. So he definitely could have done more. But here's the finale for Swan Lake. Enjoy that. Now, the only American we'll talk about is John Philip Sousa, and he's my least favorite composer of all time, mainly because I'm a horn player, and in Sousa is the March King. He wrote about 136 marches, and in marches, the French horn plays the offbeats. So it's like 3 minutes of going bum 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 ba da dum bum bum bum, and it just drives you crazy. Like there's nothing, you don't get to do anything else but offbeats, and I hate it. So not a fan, but he's important. Because he's one of the first like great American composers. Kind of established the Marine band tradition. That's kind of important. I was a huge advocate for music education and for composer rights, like copyright laws and things like that. So that's really important too. He also helped design the sousaphone, those things that you see, the big loopy tuba things that you see on marching band, in marching bands. He designed that. So pretty cool. Just really important to know that he was the March King, known for composing marches. You guys will listen to the Stars and Stripes Forever, very famous tune that you hear around 4th of July and all that. So enjoy. Not my favorite. Now, last composer, Richard Wagner, not Richard Wagner, because he's German. Richard Wagner. So Wagner, German, he was a self-taught composer. So his approach to composition was unique and different from others around him. And he really, that kind of made him a very influential person and kind of helped to um, change the direction of composition and open the doors for a lot of unique experimentation in the modern era, which we'll talk about. Now, bad thing about Wagner is that he was very anti-Semitic, meaning he did not like Jewish people. He was very outspoken about that. Therefore, when Hitler came around, Hitler was very drawn to Wagner for that reason and his music. So Hitler kind of established Wagner's music as, I guess you could say, like the national music of the Third Reich, which is awful because Wagner's music is amazing. It's some of my favorite music, but it's, forever tainted because of Hitler and the Third Reich and because of Wagner's controversial thoughts. It doesn't change the fact that he wasn't or always a great person, but it's something that we have to keep in mind when we think about these composers and their music. How much do we want to promote it based on what they did or what's been done? So there's that. Um, he was known for this idea called Gesamtkunstwerk, which in German translates to total works of art. So Wagner was very much into literature and wrote a lot of literature. He pretty much wrote the librettos, the text, the stories for all of his operas. And his idea was to marry all of these things, the unity of text, the story, the music, and the action in the opera. He wanted all of that to kind of work together. So his big idea, what he's kind of famous for, were these leitmotifs, these guiding motives. They're musical themes, musical melodies. Each melody is associated with a specific character or place, or it could be like an inanimate object, like a sword, like an important sword, or a ring, or whatever. If it's important in the story, it's going to have its own like musical representation. And these musical themes, these leitmotifs would happen anytime these people were even thought about or mentioned or come on stage. So you have all of these themes going on, they're all connected and somehow. And it's pretty cool. It's a it plays into the whole idea of romanticism and having these themes that reoccur. It's just kind of taking that one step further. um so Wagner was really known for his operas, obviously, and especially for the Ring cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen, or the Ring of the Nibelung. This is kind of Lord of the Rings esque, um, but also based heavily in Norse mythology. So you've got Odin, or Wotan as he's called. You got Thor, Loki, all those people. Um, you've got Valkyries. You've got a hero named Siegfried. And it's four operas, and all of these operas are like 4 or 5 hours long. So it takes like one whole day to get through all of these operas. But it's Das Rheingold, Die Valkyrie, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung, which is Twilight of the Gods. Um, but yeah, it's all based on Norse mythology and Valhalla and all that stuff. It's really cool. Great, amazing music. You guys will listen to Ride of the Valkyries, which is one of my favorites from Die Valkyrie. And you'll get to hear that famous tune. It's been used, gosh, so many times in many different things. You're going all the way back to Looney Tunes, What's Opera Doc, to Apocalypse Now, to other things throughout history. Um, but yeah, Ride of the Valkyries. Um, and I think, yeah, this is a pretty cool production. I think this might be the Met Opera production, which was really awesome. But anyway, hope you guys enjoyed that. So, to summarize all that stuff, romanticism, just think expression, taking everything to the extreme, um, with emotion, loud, softs, just using the imagination with stories, and just bringing in the storytelling aspect to music. That's kind of the main thing. Nationalism, taking pride in one's country. That's using folk tunes, using instruments related to native lands, writing music about certain places from where they're from, dedicating it to certain places or certain important people from the countries they're from, just that sort of thing. Program music, heavily ties into romanticism, just that storytelling aspect. The classical versus romantic. It's one of those things where they're using, they're taking classical forms like sonata forms, taking the symphony and other things and just expanding them, experimenting with it. I always think of the Romantic era as being different from the classical period just because of all the new things that are going on and a lot of the individualism that happens. Like composers are doing a lot of unique things and creating their own individual voices. And that to me is what kind of solidifies the Romantic period as something different, because you have all of this unique and different stuff going on. It may not fit neatly into this category, but there's a lot happening, especially from an individualistic standpoint, which makes sense because you have all these people that are like, these composers aren't isolated anymore. They are seeing each other, they know each other, they hear each other's music. So obviously, like, they're even being uh what's the word? I can't even think of the word, but they're being influenced by their own contemporary composers as they're working on things. Like, it's a very innovative time in history, and it continues into the modern era, as we'll talk about. So anyway, that's it. And yeah, I'll see you again for the modern era video. So take care.